I feel like at this point, work-life balance is kind of a cliched term. It's like, what does it even mean when people say work-life balance? Something I've been thinking a lot about recently is work-life balance, so I thought I'd sit down and have a conversation about it. So I thought we'd start by trying to define it. So this is a very personal process, and I think the first step in trying to define it for you is to figure out if you're working to live or living to work. Another way to word that is, are you centering your life around work, or is work something that lives on the edge of your life that you kind of just have to do to facilitate the rest of the stuff? A way that I like to answer this question is to ask myself, if I take what I do for work right now, would I still do that if I wasn't getting paid? If the answer to that is no, then you're probably just working to live. But if the answer to that is yes, then maybe you're living to work, but it may not be the case. But knowing the answer to that question is a very useful first step. So for me personally, I genuinely love software, and I do a lot of software projects that I don't get paid for. I'm just doing them because I find it fun. I find it relaxing to work on personal side projects. So yes, for me, I would still do what I do for a living, even if I wasn't getting paid. But that doesn't mean that you need to feel that way. Everybody's different, and that's why this is such a nuanced topic. But knowing the answer to that question is going to help inform what balance is supposed to be for you. Because balance for one person might be working 10 or 12 hours a day because they genuinely love what they do. They would do it even if they weren't getting paid, and they don't have a whole lot else going on in their lives. So for them, maybe they can find balance there at a sustainable rate, and that's pretty key. Things have to be sustainable. If you're going to burn out, you are not balanced. But then for another person who is purely working just to facilitate everything else in their lives, ideally, they don't have to work because they have a whole bunch of other stuff they want to do. But of course, we need money, we need to eat, so they're going to need to work a little bit, but they want to find balance at a point where they're making enough money to do the rest of the stuff without their work encroaching on everything else they want to do. And then another thing to consider on top of all of that is that not every hour is created equal. The age-old advice is that you should fill the 24 hours of your day with 8 hours of sleeping, 8 hours of working, and 8 hours of enjoying yourself. But that's a very naive way of looking at things, and technically yes, that is balanced because you have 3 balanced 8-hour sections of your day, but that completely neglects the idea that all hours are created differently. And to illustrate that point, an hour in a workday of a lumberjack is entirely different to an hour in the day of me, like a software engineer, where I'm just tippy-tapping on a keyboard. So my hours are objectively much easier than a lumberjack who was working manual labor. Yes, my work might be more mentally taxing, but that's different, right? So yes, you could get into some philosophical arguments, and I'm sure some people would want to, about the merits of manual labor versus mental exertion and how you can compare the two and whatever. I'm not interested in that. They're different. So if they're different, they are not equal. Yes? Right? So therefore, an hour in the day of a lumberjack is different and not equal to an hour in my day. So we can't have the same way of balancing our lives because our hours are different, our work schedule is different, everything is different. So just balancing purely based on 3 8-hour sections doesn't seem like the right approach. But one thing should be mentioned for sure is that regardless of who you are, if you have the option of considering ways of balancing your work and life, you're in a very privileged position. Some people have to work ridiculous hours just to facilitate their lives, where some of us are privileged enough that we can make decisions about how to best balance things in our lives. We have the option to maybe work a little less to allow us to do the other things in our lives. And that's a great position to be in. So if you're in that position, count yourself lucky. And thinking about the software industry specifically, there's a massive stigma around you have to be extremely passionate about what you do. You have to work yourself to the bone just to become a mediocre success in the industry. you have to work like 60 or 80-hour weeks and be so driven and passionate. And I mean, that's just not true. And it's harmful to portray that stereotype to people who are just getting into the industry. I've spoken with a lot of people and seen people posting on Reddit and various other places online where they're like, I want to get into software, but I can't work 80 hours a week. So how am I ever going to be successful? Because I hear that's the only way you can do it. I mean, I don't work close to 80 hours a week, and I'm doing just fine in the industry. So like, just dispel all myths that that's the only way to succeed. Like I said, I love what I do. I'm really passionate about software, but I don't work anywhere close to 80 hours a week. And you don't have to. There will be some jobs where you start working at a startup, or maybe you've started your own company, where you may have to put in those kind of hours, but know that that's not the only option in the industry. If you don't want to work 80 hours, that's not your bag, you just don't want to do that, there's other options. You can find somewhere else where you don't have to work that hard if it's not what you want to do. And if you are working that hard and you are putting in 80-hour weeks, be very mindful about the impact it's going to have on your life long term. Is it sustainable for you? Are you constantly tired? Because if you are, you're not balanced. And if you're putting in that work and you're not balanced, you're going to burn out. And if you burn out, you're not doing any work at all. So yes, you front-loaded tons of work by putting in 80 hours a week in, but now you're completely incapacitated because you burned out and you're putting in 0 hours, and it's not going to take that long for you to catch up. So it's like the old tortoise and the hare kind of idea, where just slow and steady wins the race, and I think it's also applicable here. So yes, it's fine to be passionate about your work, it's fine to love what you do, but just know that you don't have to do that. And you don't have to put in the crazy hours if it's not who you are, if it's not what you want to do. And on the flip side of that, we have hobbies. And I think a lot of people have a weird relationship with the word hobbies. I've met a lot of people who say they don't have hobbies, and I find that extremely hard to believe. It's just, I think what's actually going on is they have hobbies, they just don't deem them worthy of the title of hobby, whatever they decide that means. So I'm going to define hobby right now as anything that you do with your time where you're not getting paid to do it. And that's a pretty loose definition, but that could include anything from like watching Netflix and just reading a book, or going for a walk, or like even just lying on the sofa doing nothing. If that's what you want to do with your time when you're not getting paid, then that's a hobby. So the idea behind work-life balance is supposed to be that you somehow have a balance between your hobbies and the rest of the things you do with your life when you're not getting paid, and the time that you spend getting paid to do something. But where does that leave people whose hobby is what they get paid to do? I mean, are they balanced? Are they not balanced? It's difficult to say, because we kind of think about the work-life balance as if they're two separate things that happen, but everything that happens in your life is your life. That includes work, that includes everything. And a lot of people would consider being in a position where you do your hobby and get paid to do it as being a very privileged position. But I think even that is viewed through a strange lens quite often, because you might meet somebody, for example, who's a BMX bike rider, and they get paid to do it, and it's their hobby, it's what they've always loved to do, and now they're getting paid to do it, and people are like, oh, that's great, man. It's like, you're living the dream, you're doing exactly what you would do as a hobby, and you're getting paid, you're just living the dream, it's great. But then that same person who's just said all that stuff meets somebody who is a software developer, who also writes software as a hobby, and they don't have the same reaction to them. They're just like, oh, that guy's probably a workaholic. He just writes code like all the time. And it's because that's considered more of a stereotypical work thing. So if you do that as a hobby, you're a workaholic. But BMXing is considered more of a hobby. So when you do that for a job, you're living the dream. But it's like they're fundamentally the same thing, because some people like to BMX, some people like to write code. Some people like to do both. And it's like, that's the whole tricky thing. So ultimately, there is no one solution where you can just say, do this, and like this formulaic thing, and you now have work-life balance. It's going to be completely different for every individual. And some people don't even have the option of considering work-life balance because they just have to do all the work just to facilitate their minimal living. But if you are one of the people who was lucky enough to be able to consider how to balance work and life, this is the way that I like to think about it. How much time when you're working do you spend thinking about your hobbies? And conversely, how much time when you're doing your hobbies do you spend thinking about your work? If you try to strive towards a situation where when you're doing your hobbies, that's what you're doing and you're not thinking about work, and when you're working, that's what you're doing and you're not thinking about your hobbies. If you can strive for that, that's what balance is. And if you're spending a lot of time thinking about your hobbies while you're working and vice versa, you're probably not balanced. So you should probably try and cut back on one. And I think that's a way that's very subjective, and that allows you to trend towards your own personal work-life balance without following some formula that says do X, Y, and whatever, and you'll be balanced. But then even that is not quite good enough because there's going to be short-term fluctuations on that. You might pick up a new hobby and you become really into that hobby as you're in the sort of romantic honeymoon period with that hobby. And you're going to spend all of your time working, wanting to do this new cool thing that you've discovered. And then there'll be other times where you're working on a really awesome project at work and you're going to be spending your times outside of work thinking about the problems or the things you're working on in that project. And that's fine. That just because you have those thoughts doesn't mean you're not balanced, because those short-term fluctuations are going to happen. But you find that you're not balanced if you're constantly, over a long period of time, finding yourself thinking about one or the other thing. That's when you're not balanced. And that's when you should start thinking about things that you can do to start balancing things out. And also just know that it's fine to take a break. Even if you're somebody who wants to work and can sustainably work for 80 hours a week, it's fine to take a break. If you're an Olympic level athlete or any kind of world-class athlete in any sport, you cannot work at peak performance every single day. You can't even work out at peak performance at every single day, because if you could, then it's clearly not your peak, because peak kind of implies that it's a maximal exertion that you can do and then you need to tone back and rest, right? Nobody can be at peak all the time. So these athletes will train, and then they'll have an Olympic event once every 4 years where they're just at peak performance, and then maybe there's world championships or whatever, but these events are not happening every single day. They're happening infrequently with rest periods where they're still working, they're just not working at the same intensity level. And that's the way that they operate, because they understand the nuances of peak performance. So if your particular sport is mental, so you're a software engineer, for example, you can't be working at 100% peak performance all the time. If you're doing 80-hour weeks, you are not at peak all 80 hours, and you cannot sustain that over the long term. You have to understand it's a cyclical process. You will be at peak performance for a few hours, and then you've got to tone back. And understanding that cycle is going to help you in the long run. So it's okay to take a break. Like, you don't have to feel like you're losing or you're failing if you take a break. That's absolutely fine. And one last thing I'd like to say is that you shouldn't project your thoughts on what it is to be balanced onto other people. I see this all the time where people who are workaholic types work crazy hours and they look at other people and say, oh, they're just not doing enough. It's like, I work hard, they don't. It's like, maybe they don't want to. Maybe their priorities are different. It's like, your work-life balance maybe just puts you all the way into work and that's all you do. Where this other person does a whole bunch of other stuff. And neither is better or worse. They're just different. So don't project your ideas onto them. And even more commonly, you see people who work 40 hours a week and then they have a lot of hobbies, and they look at the workaholic type who's working 80 hours and they say, oh, well, they're just working too much. It's like, maybe they are. And in a lot of cases, they actually are working too much. But you can't know that because you don't know what their priorities are, you don't know what they really enjoy doing, you don't know very much about them at all, really. So don't project your ideas of what it is to be balanced onto them. Instead, just acknowledge that that is a thing that they do, and maybe seek to learn more if you do think that they're being unsustainable. But anyway, that is enough rambling from me today. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give me a big thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, all of that good stuff. I have a Patreon. If you really enjoy what I'm doing, you can check that out. But until next time, stay hungry and keep coding.